is wasted.
Kurt, you start off in your speech, which we have written, defining some acronyms. Would you care to do that for the benefit of the listening audience and get us started with your discussion?
Sure. I'll try not to use too many acronyms, but when people think of pensions, there are two broad types. One is called defined benefit pension plan, and the other is called defined contribution pension plan. What people think of as pensions, as the traditional pension, is the defined benefit pension plan. So I would prefer to call it a traditional pension plan. And what that is some variation of the following. You take your years of credited service, and you take a percentage multiplier, and you take some formula for final average pay, and you multiply those out. For example, 30 years of service, if 2% is the multiplier, and if your pay is $100,000, then 30 times 2% is 60%. 60% of 100,000 is 60,000, and then that $60,000 becomes your pension for life.
And that is that DBP, or defined benefit plan, is what the city now uses with the police, fire, and general employees. Is that correct?
That's correct, although the city is more generous than what I just described. Yes, I think for purposes of this show we ought to call it a traditional pension plan. The other type of plan is what people think of as a 401k plan. They're not always called 401k plans. They can have lots of different names, but they're all pretty much the same. And in those plans, instead of getting a lifetime annuity, you have an individual account. Maybe the employer puts in $5,000, maybe you put in $3,000, that $8,000 gets invested, and it grows to, it either goes up or it goes down, and it grows to something, and you keep on doing that year after year. And then when you get older, you have an asset that is worth whatever it is worth, and then when you leave the employer, that asset is yours to either roll over into an IRA or do something else with.
But you don't wind up having any sort of guaranteed amount that you're going to receive from the 401k.
Well, if you have a 401k, and you can convert it into annuity if you want. I mean, that is an individual choice you have at the time. But you don't have to, and some people don't.
Okay. Well, what's the genesis of the crisis that we have right now? I know that in the last budget cycle, and I can't remember the specific number, perhaps you can, Dave, there was a big shortfall because we suddenly, shockingly discovered that part of our pension plan appeared to be underfunded, and there was a large contribution that had to be made this year and an even larger contribution next year, and ad infinitum, apparently.
Right. Well, there are several geneses, I guess that's the right word, of the problem. I mean, the obvious one is politics, but to be more precise, traditional pension plans are not widely understood by politicians, and so politicians can easily get snookered. And the politicians in Jacksonville, frankly, were snookered over the years. They're much more generous than people say they are. They're much more costly than people pretend they are. And when I say people, I mean unions and public employees. And now we've had a 10-year period where the stock market's gone up and down, but really has gone nowhere. The stock market really in America has done nothing since 2000. You know, the 80s and 90s, which were great for investors, have not been repeated. A lot of people were thinking, oh, the 80s and 90s, they've been great, therefore it's just going to go on and on and on. Well, it stopped. It's kind of like musical chairs. The party ended, and investments stopped doing as well as they used to do. But the promises are there, and salaries keep on going up. So it probably started to fall apart 4 or 5 years ago, that would be my guess, but it didn't really get any notice until recently. And the important thing is that this 1.2 billion deficit, which I talk about a lot, basically the liability of the city under the three plans is $1.2 billion greater than the assets that are behind the liability.
We could build a couple of houses with that.
With 3 or 4. But that's as of October 1, 2008. It's very possible that when the numbers come out in a few months, that deficit is $2 billion. There's a reasonable chance. I don't have access to those numbers because the city doesn't want me to have access to those numbers. But it's really dangerous, and it could be far more than $2 billion in a few years. And there's only two things that are going to save the city. Number one is that all of a sudden investments turn around and start performing fabulously. Or number two, benefits have to be cut back going forward.
Well, I see that you mentioned that there's presumed return on assets in these plans of at least 8.4% per year.
Correct.
And so so obviously in any year in which you don't get that rate of return on the pension fund, not only does that have to be made up, but then you'd have to make up that deficit the next year, including on the amount that was by which it fell short the year before. I mean, I see this it's a compound interest problem.
Right.
I mean, you can quickly be doubling the amount that has to be contributed into the pension plan if you don't get this rate of return, or if you get what is the actual rate of return? Do you have an idea? Have they given that to you?
Well, actual rates of return depend on the period you're talking about. Obviously, in 2008, the returns were quite negative. I don't have that number at my fingertip. 2009, the numbers have not been released. There's a chance that they were positive because the market bottomed out in March and started turning around. But the real problem is, in order to get out of this horrible hole, not only do you have to get the 8.5% positive return, but you have to cover administrative costs, which are $14 million a year. So you really, and I said 8.5 because one plan has 8.5 and the other has 8.4. But and then you have to cover the administrative costs, which are $14 million a year. So that really forces the plans to earn at least 9% a year to cover all these costs. Mm-hmm. And 9% is pretty tough, even if you have practically all of your assets in the stock market. 9% is a tough standard.
And if you fall behind that 9%, things get very difficult after that.
It gets progressively worse. Then your liability goes up, and then contributions have to go up to amortize that liability, and it's just like an individual who gets in debt. Yep. Once you start getting heavily in debt, it's awfully hard to get out of it.
And I think I like that kind of a statement because people understand this in general. I mean, we're not talking about something that is necessarily much different from the economy of a family or an individual trying to make investments. But let me ask you, the defined contribution plan is also dependent on the economy and investments. Where would you rate the two different plans, the defined benefit and the defined contribution, in terms of vulnerability to economic trends?
Well, it depends on your standpoint. If you are an employer, and the city is an employer, and so is the sheriff's office, and every governmental unit is an employer. From the employer's standpoint, the defined contribution plan is easy to budget. Whatever the formula is, let's say it's 5% of pay, 7% of pay, whatever it is, you know what it's going to be. So if your payroll is $100 million, you add $7 million for contributions to a defined contribution plan.
So the $14 million we're now paying for the defined benefit plan for administrative costs and investment expertise, that wouldn't necessarily be so high of a cost with a defined contribution plan?
Oh, it would be much lower, maybe $1